Sicily and landed in Normandy on D-Day +3. He had earned every medal on his chest through blood and steel, and he had absolutely zero patience for a corporal who thought he knew more about fighting tanks than officers who had been doing it for 2 years. When Captain Hayes brought's notebook observations up the chain's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He called Hayes into his command post on the evening before the expected engagement and made his position perfectly clear. Captain, are you telling me that a tank driver, a mechanic, is advising my regiment on armored tactics against Tiger tanks? Hayes tried to explain the observations were sound, they matched zone tactical guidelines, the information about turret traverse rates, fuel consumption, mechanical vulnerabilities. It was practical intelligence gathered from direct combat experience. Cut him off. I've been fighting German armor since I lost 14 tanks at I know what Tigers can do, and what Tigers can do is kill Shermans. The answer to Tigers is not some grease monkey's notebook. The answer is concentration of force, proper reconnaissance, and disciplined fire and maneuver, not whatever cowboy nonsense. His headquarters is cooking up. Subjection wasn't irrational. His experience at Pass in February 1943 had been catastrophic. American forces had attacked German positions without coordination and had been slaughtered. Had learned a brutal lesson there. You don't rush into a fight against superior armor. You plan carefully. You concentrate your forces. You attack with overwhelming numbers at a single point. What was ordering splitting forces into multiple columns, accelerating toward the strongest concentration of Tigers ever assembled. Looked too exactly like the kind of reckless aggression that had gotten hundreds of Americans killed at. He ordered Hayes to shove's observations. Standard doctrine would be followed. The regiment would advance in concentrated formation, engage Tigers at range, and rely on numerical superiority. This was exactly the kind of fight Tigers were designed to win, and was about to order his men into it. Heard about the colonel's decision from lieutenant that same evening, was frustrated. He'd seen what Tigers could do at. He knew that a concentrated formation advancing across open ground against prepared Tiger positions was a death sentence for the leading tanks, but was a lieutenant, was a colonel. The chain of command existed for a reason. Didn't care about the chain of command. He cared about the men in his tank, the men in his company, the men who would die tomorrow morning if they drove straight at 92 Tigers in a neat formation that the German gunners would pick apart like target practice. So did something that could have gotten him court-martialed. He went over his head, but he didn't go alone. Because he'd found an unexpected ally, Major Thomas was the regiment's operations officer. The S3 was responsible for planning the regiment's tactical movements, and he had been quietly studying the same intelligence that had produced anti-Tiger guidelines. Was 31 years old, a former engineering student from MIT who had been commissioned through OCS in 1942. He understood machines, he understood systems, and he understood that his plan would get men killed for no strategic gain. Had read his notebook not because brought it to him, but because Captain Hayes had quietly slipped it onto his desk 3 days earlier with a note that said simply, "The mechanic sees what we're missing." Had his observations against intelligence reports. The turret traverse rate was accurate, the fuel consumption data matched captured German logistics documents, the mechanical reliability estimates aligned with reports from units that had recovered disabled Tigers. When came to his tent that night, was already working on an alternative plan, not to replace his orders entirely, but to modify them enough to give the regiment a fighting chance. His plan kept the basic structure of his advance but added critical elements. Advanced scouts would identify Tiger positions before the main force committed. Artillery would be pre-registered on likely Tiger positions and ready to fire within 90 seconds of contact. Tank destroyers would be positioned on the flanks, not in the main column, ready to maneuver for side shots the moment Tigers revealed themselves, and crucially no single company would advance alone across open ground. If one company drew fire, adjacent companies would immediately flank. The problem was that implementing this plan required his approval, and had made his position clear, made a decision that risked his career. He contacted 3rd Army headquarters directly, bypassing, and requested that a representative from staff be present for the morning briefing. The request was granted. Lieutenant Colonel David, one of his most trusted tactical advisors, would attend. The next morning, September 12th, the briefing was tense. Presented his plan: concentrated advance, masked armor, engage Tigers at range with numerical superiority, standard doctrine. When finished spoke, he didn't criticize directly. Instead, he laid out Third Army intelligence on the German deployment, 3 lines of Tigers prepared. Positions with pre-registered kill zones, infantry support with anti-tank weapons covering the gaps between Tiger. Positions, estimated time to breach the first line under plan 8 to 12. Hours, estimated American tank losses during that breach, 40 to 60% of the leading battalion. The room went silent, his face was stone. Continued, under's preferred approach, multiple axes of advance with combined arms coordination. The estimated breach time dropped to 4 to 6 hours. Estimated losses dropped to 15 to push back. Those estimates assume perfect coordination. In combat, coordination breaks down, radios fail, smoke obscures targets, men panic, concentrated force gives us mass, and mass wins battles. Shook his head, mass wins battles when the enemy is dispersed. When the enemy is concentrated in prepared positions with the most powerful tank guns in the world, mass just gives them a target-rich environment. General's orders were clear, multiple axes, combined arms, speed. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive from Third Army Command, delivered politely but unmistakably. Had no choice. He accepted the revised plan, though afterward he warned bluntly. If this goes wrong, Major, it's your career, and that mechanic's stripes on the line, not mine. Didn't blink. He had 16 hours to prepare the regiment for the largest Tiger engagement in American military history, and the clock was already running. The morning of September 13, 1944 broke gray and cool, with low fog settling into the valleys of eastern France. The fog was a gift. It reduced visibility to less than 500 yards, temporarily neutralizing the Tigers' greatest advantage, their ability to destroy targets at extreme range. Sat in the driver's seat, engine idling, watching the mist curl around the hull of his Sherman. Lieutenant stood in the turret, scanning through binoculars made nearly useless by the murk. The radio crackled with position reports from scout units ahead. First contact came at 6:47. A reconnaissance team reported Tiger tanks along a roughly 1,200 yards ahead, at least 8 visible, likely more behind the crest. They were hull down with only their turrets exposed above the terrain, guns trained directly on the main approach road, exactly where German intelligence expected American armor to appear. Under its original plan, the regiment would have advanced straight up that road. The first company to crest the rise would have been exposed to 8 Tiger guns at once. At 1,200 yards, the Tigers would have enjoyed roughly 45 seconds of unobstructed fire before the Shermans could close to effective range. Firing every 8 seconds, 8 Tigers could deliver about 45 rounds of 88 shells into the lead company before it could even return fire. The math was annihilating. Instead's plan took effect. The lead company halted short of the ridge and transmitted artillery coordinates. Within 3 minutes, 105 shells began falling on the Tiger positions. Not to destroy them, the rounds could not penetrate Tiger armor from that angle, but to force the crews to button up, sealing their hatches and sacrificing the external visibility they relied on for accurate long-range fire. Simultaneously, Company and 2 others peeled off the main road, moving through the fog along secondary tracks that the scouts had identified during the night. Pushed his Sherman through a muddy farm lane, barely wide enough for the tank branches scraping the whole visibility down to 200 wide. His heart was hammering somewhere ahead, and to his right the Tigers were sitting on that ridge, their guns covering the main road, not expecting anything from this direction. At 7:12, company emerged from a tree line 600 to the left flank of the Tiger position, 600 at that range. The Tigers' side armor of 80 was vulnerable to the Sherman's 75 gun. More importantly, the Tigers' turrets were facing the wrong direction, pointed down the main road where artillery was still falling. Gave the order to fire. 5 Shermans from company opened up simultaneously on the exposed flanks of the Tiger positions, felt his tank rock with the recoil. Through his periscope he saw a flash against the side of the nearest Tiger, a hit then another. The Tiger's turret began to traverse toward them, that slow grinding rotation that had timed so many times in his notebook. 60 seconds for a full traverse. They had 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds, company fired 23 rounds. 4 Tigers were hit from the side, 2 began to smoke, 1 exploded as ammunition cooked off inside. The 4th Tiger's track was shattered, immobilizing it. Remaining Tigers on the line were now caught between artillery from the front and tank fire from the flank. Their carefully prepared kill zone had become a trap, and they were inside it. At the same moment, P-47 Thunderbolts arrived overhead. The fog had lifted enough for air operations, and requested air support descended on the German positions with rockets and 500 bombs. 2 more Tigers were hit from above. One took a direct rocket hit to The engine deck and burst into flame. The crew belayed out and ran, tank destroyers that had circled even wider. Then's company now appeared on the Tiger's right flank, M18 Hellcats fast, and lightly armored but mounting 76mm guns that could penetrate Tiger's sidearm at combat range. They fired and displaced, never staying in one position long enough for the Tigers to engage. Them within 90 minutes of first contact, 11 of the estimated 15 Tigers in the first defensive line were destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned. American losses were 4 Shermans destroyed and 2 damaged. The ratio that was supposed to be 4 Shermans per Tiger had been almost reversed. The first line was broken, but this was only the first line. Behind it, at least 60 more Tigers waited in the second and third defensive positions, and the Germans had been watching. They had seen their first line collapse in minutes instead of holding. For days, they were already adapting, repositioning, closing the gaps that flanking maneuver had exploited. Colonel, watching the first engagement from his command, said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up the radio and called. The mechanic's information was correct. About the traverse rate, what else does he know about their second line? It was the closest thing to an apology would ever receive, and it was enough. Headquarters received the report within the hour. 11 Tigers destroyed in 90 minutes with minimal American losses. The response from 3rd Army was a single sentence that embodied everything believed about warfare. Do not stop. Repeat, do not stop. The regiment pushed forward toward the 2nd Tiger line, but the Germans had learned. They had repositioned their Tigers to cover multiple approaches, not just the main road. They had pulled infantry closer to the tank positions to prevent flanking maneuvers. They had dispersed their Tigers more widely to reduce the effectiveness of artillery concentrations. The second line would be harder, and something else was happening that nobody on the American side knew about yet. A German signals unit had intercepted fragments of American radio traffic during the first engagement. They had heard the coordination between tanks, artillery, and air support. They had heard references to Tiger weaknesses, and they had transmitted report to German high command that would change how the remaining Tigers fought. The Germans were adapting. The easy victories were over. Notebook had helped break the first line, but 60 Tigers remained in there. Crews were no longer sitting in prepared positions, waiting for Americans to come to them. They were moving, repositioning, setting up ambushes in locations the Americans hadn't scouted, hiding towns and forests where air support was useless and artillery was dangerous to use. The Tiger crews had received new orders from German command. Do not fight defensively, do not hold positions, hunt the Shermans, use the towns, use the forests, use the night. Turn the Tigers' weaknesses into strengths by fighting at close range, where American coordination couldn't save them. In Part 1, figured out how to fight Tigers. In Part 2, his ideas helped shatter the first defensive line, but in Part 3, the Tigers would stop being the hunted and start being the hunters. The Germans were coming not in defensive lines anymore, in ambush teams of 2 and 3, hiding in every village and between, and the rules of the game had changed completely, and the real war was just beginning. A former auto mechanic named wrote a notebook about Tiger tank weaknesses. That notebook helped reshape 3rd Army tactics. In the first engagements, forces shattered the 1st German defensive line, destroying 11 Tigers in 90 minutes with minimal losses, the ratio that was supposed to favor Tigers had been reversed. But as Part 2 ended, German signals intelligence had intercepted American radio traffic. They heard the coordination, they heard references to Tiger vulnerabilities, and they issued new orders to their remaining crews: stop defending, start hunting. 60 Tigers changed from stationary fortresses into mobile ambush predators hiding in villages and forests where American air support was blind and artillery was dangerous. The easy part was over. The statistics that followed proved it. In the next 36 hours, American tank losses tripled compared to the first engagement. 8 Shermans were destroyed in a single afternoon by just 3 Tigers operating in ambush teams inside a French village. And now, this was no longer an experiment in tactics. This was a fight for survival on both sides. German command reacted to the destruction of their first defensive line with a speed that surprised American intelligence. Within hours of receiving the signals, Intercept General Fritz, commanding the remnants of Panzer Lehr Division and coordinating Tiger operations in the sector, convened an emergency meeting with his surviving Tiger Company commanders. Was no fool, he had commanded tanks in North Africa under He had fought the British, the Americans, and he understood that clinging to doctrine. When doctrine was failing meant death, the intercepted radio traffic told Bayer. Line exactly what the Americans were doing, combined arms coordination. Flanking maneuvers against Tiger side armor, artillery suppression to force crews to button up, airstrikes on. Exposed positions. Every advantage the Tiger possessed in a prepared defensive position was being systematically neutralized. Orders were radical by German standards: abandon the remaining two defensive lines, disperse the Tigers into teams of 2 or 3, move them into villages, forests, and urban areas where American air power could not operate effectively, and where artillery risked killing French civilians and destroying infrastructure the Americans themselves needed. Fight at close range, ambush, and withdraw. Never stay in one position longer than 30 minutes. Use the Tiger's massive gun not at long range where flanking was possible, but at point-blank range inside towns where a single shot down a narrow street could destroy multiple vehicles. It was the opposite of everything Tiger crews had been trained to do, but it was brilliant. Within 12 hours, the remaining 60 operational Tigers had vanished from their defensive positions. American scouts reported the second and third lines abandoned. For a brief moment, American commanders thought the Germans were retreating. They were wrong. The first ambush came at the village of a column of 6 Shermans from Charlie Company advanced through the village's main street. Standard procedure: infantry screening ahead, tanks following in file. The lid Sherman reached the village square. A Tiger was hidden inside a partially collapsed barn, its gun barrel protruding just 3 past the rubble. Range was 80 yards. At 80 yards, the 88mm round went through the front armor of the lead Sherman, through the engine compartment and out the back plate. The Sherman behind it took a round through the turret before the crew even identified where the shot came from. The Tiger reversed out of the barn, crushing the rear wall, and disappeared down an alley before American tank destroyers could respond. 2 Shermans destroyed, 0 damage to the Tiger. Time elapsed 45 seconds. This was the new war. 3 more ambushes followed that afternoon. A Tiger hidden behind a farmhouse, 2 Tigers positioned at opposite ends of a crossroads, creating a crossfire. A single Tiger concealed in a sunken lane that fired into the side of a passing column and then into woods. By evening, 8 American tanks were destroyed and 3 damaged. No Tigers lost. The combined arms approach that had worked so brilliantly against the first defensive line was useless in close terrain where every advantage belonged to the ambusher. But this was not the only problem facing S forces. Inside Third Army, a crisis was developing that threatened to undo everything S observations had helped achieve. The success of the first engagement had created overconfidence. Some company commanders, having seen Tigers destroyed relatively easily in the first battle, began treating all Tiger encounters as simple tactical problems. They stopped calling for artillery support. They stopped waiting for air cover. They advanced aggressively into terrain they hadn't scouted, assuming that speed and flanking would solve every engagement. It didn't. At the ambush at killed 3 men from S own battalion. One of them was Corporal James Dunning's loader, who had been transferred to another crew just 2 days earlier to replace a wounded man. Found out over the radio. He sat in his driver's seat and didn't speak for an hour. Colonel, who had initially opposed the modified tactics, now used the mounting casualties to push back against this approach entirely. He sent a report to division headquarters, arguing that the dispersed Tiger tactics made combined arms coordination impossible, and that the regiment should halt, consolidate, and wait for reinforcements before continuing the advance. The report included the casualty figures from the ambushes: 8 tanks, 23 killed, 14 wounded in a single afternoon. Division forwarded the report to 3rd Army. For 12 hours there was silence from headquarters, and every man in the regiment waited, not knowing whether the advance would continue or whether they would dig and face weeks of grinding attrition against Tigers that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Some officers privately blamed Notebook for creating the overconfidence that led to the ambush losses. If the first engagement hadn't gone so well, would have been more cautious. If's plan hadn't worked so perfectly, commanders wouldn't have become reckless. The mechanics' observations had helped win the first battle, and some argued had contributed to losing the second. Himself wondered if they were right. 3 men were dead. James Dunning was dead, and the Tigers were still out there, invisible, waiting. But then a message arrived that changed everything. Himself sent the response, not through staff channels, directly over the command net in Language that every radio operator in the regiment could hear. The message was vintage Patton, blunt, profane, and absolutely clear. Tigers hiding in villages means tigers have abandoned the open ground. They gave up their defensive lines. They are reacting to us. We do not stop because the enemy adapts. We adapt faster. New orders follow. The new orders arrived within the hour, and they represented a tactical evolution that would become a case study for the next 80 years. Staff had analyzed the ambush pattern in real time. Tigers in villages needed narrow streets and buildings for concealment. They operated in pairs or threes. They fired, and weakness was movement. A tiger revering through a village was slow, loud, and visible. It couldn't hide once it fired, and it couldn't reposition faster than radio could transmit its location. New plan was simple and devastating. Every infantry squad advancing through a village would carry smoke grenades, and SCR-536 handheld radios upon Tiger contact infantry would immediately pop smoke to obscure the Tiger sight line and radio the exact position. Tank destroyers would not enter the village. They would be prepositioned at every exit road waiting. Artillery would fire white phosphorus rounds to mark the Tiger's location from above, and P-47s would orbit overhead not to bomb the village, but to track any Tiger attempting to withdraw and hit it once it reached open ground. The Americans were turning every village into a trap. If a Tiger fired from inside a town, it revealed itself. Smoke cut its vision. Tank destroyers blocked its escape routes. Aircraft tracked it from above. The ambush predator became the ambush prey. September 15th, the village of population 400, 3 streets, 1 church, 2 bridges, American intelligence had identified probable Tiger positions based on track marks and a report from a French farmer who had watched 2 Tigers drive into barns on the east side of the village the previous night. Major personally planned the engagement. Infantry from Baker Company entered the village from the west at 5:30, moving in small teams along building walls, checking corners, marking potential Tiger hiding positions with chalk. Tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion positioned at every road leading out of the village. 4 vehicles, 4 exits, no escape. Artillery battery registered on the village square and eastern approaches. P-47s on standby at 8,000. Sherman and 3 others waited 400 wide west of the village. They were bait. Their job was to advance slowly along the main road, presenting exactly the kind of target that Tiger ambush crews couldn't resist. A column of Shermans approaching in file, the same formation that had been destroyed at Drove. His hands were steady, but his mouth was dry. He was the first tank in the column, the first target. If a Tiger fired from inside the village, his Sherman would be the one it hit. Sat above him in the turret, scanning windows and rooftops through his periscope. Nobody spoke. At 6:14, Sherman reached the first buildings. The street narrowed, walls rose on both sides, exactly the killing ground a Tiger would choose. At 6:17, the Tiger fired round past 3 feet above his turret, close enough that the shock wave cracked his periscope. The Tiger was in a barn 120 yards ahead, its barrel visible through a gap in the doors. It had aimed for the turret and missed high, an 88 round that missed high by 3, was alive by 36 in, screamed into the radio. Tiger barn, east side, 120 yards Main Street. Everything happened simultaneously. Smoke grenades flew from infantry positions on both sides of the street. Within seconds, white smoke billowed across the road, cutting the Tiger's line of sight. The Tiger fired again, blind the round, smashing through the wall of a house to his left and exiting through the roof, threw the Sherman into reverse and backed out of the kill zone at full speed, tracks grinding on cobblestones. Artillery opened up, not on the barn, on the roads east of the village. White phosphorus rounds burst in brilliant white clouds, marking every exit route. The P-47s overhead banked hard, pilots looking for movement. Inside the barn, the Tiger crew made their decision. They couldn't see, they couldn't stay, they had to move. Tiger's engine roared. It crashed through the barn's rear wall and turned onto a side street heading east toward the nearest bridge. It never reached the bridge. A tank destroyer from the 74th was positioned 200 wide from the bridge hull down behind a stone wall. The Tiger came around a corner at 12, turret still facing west toward the smoke. Tank destroyer fired twice. Both rounds hit the Tiger's side armor at 200 wide. The first penetrated. The second detonated ammunition inside the hull. The Tiger erupted. The second Tiger in the village tried to withdraw north. A P-47 pilot tracked it from overhead, radioing its position to second tank destroyer covering the northern road. the Tiger emerged from between two houses into a narrow lane. The tank destroyer fired from 300 wide. First round hit the front drive. Sprocket immobilizing the Tiger, the crew bilayed out, infantry captured 3. Of the 4 crew members within minutes, 2 Tigers engaged, 2 Tigers destroyed. Or captured, 0 American tanks lost, 0 American fatalities. Became the template. Within 24 hours, every company in the regiment had received the new tactical procedures. Within 48 hours, the approach spread across the entire 3rd Army sector. Results were staggering. In the 3 days before the village trap tactic was implemented, Tiger ambushes had destroyed 14 American tanks and killed 37 men. In the 3 days after, American forces engaged and destroyed 19 Tigers while losing only 5 Shermans. The kill ratio had shifted from nearly 3-1 in the Tigers' favor during the ambush phase to almost 4-1 in American favor. News of the village trap spread through the 3rd Army like electricity. Tank crews who had been terrified of entering villages now actively sought Tiger contacts, knowing the system worked. Morale surged. Commanders who had resisted its aggressive approach saw the numbers and converted. Colonel, who had argued for halting the advance, quietly stopped sending reports to division recommending consolidation. German commanders noticed the shift immediately. Reports from this period captured after the war revealed growing desperation. His dispersal tactic had worked for barely 48 hours before the Americans adapted. Tiger losses accelerated. Crews were increasingly reluctant to engage, knowing that firing their gun was essentially signing their own death warrant if they were inside a village. Some crews abandoned their Tigers without firing at all, preferring capture to the near certainty of destruction. By September 18th, 5 days after the first engagement, 67 of the original 92 Tigers were destroyed, captured, abandoned, or immobilized. 25 remained nominally operational, but fuel shortages had reduced that number to perhaps 15 that could actually move and fight. German High Command's Hammer operation had not just failed, it had become a catastrophe. The strategic impact extended far beyond one regiment or one sector. Intelligence reports on anti-Tiger tactics were distributed to every Allied army in the European theater. British forces adopted modified versions within weeks. The psychological effect on German armored forces was profound. Tiger crews who had entered battle believing themselves invulnerable now understood they were priority targets in a sophisticated killing system. German war production records show that by October 1944, requests from field commanders for Tiger replacements dropped sharply, not because Tigers weren't needed but because commanders had concluded that committing Tigers against forces was simply feeding expensive machines into a destruction system. The resources were better spent on defensive fortifications and infantry weapons. The myth of the invincible Tiger, the weapon that had terrorized Allied armies since North Africa, was dying in the fields and villages of eastern France, received a Bronze Star for his role. Auburn engagement, Major was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. Captain Hayes received a Silver Star for leading the company through 4 Tiger engagements without a single crew fatality. Even Colonel, who had initially opposed everything, received a commendation for the regiment's overall performance. But the war was not over. Far from it, the Tigers that remained were being pulled back toward the German border, and behind that border something was being planned that would dwarf Operation Iron Hammer, something that would throw 250,000 German soldiers and the last reserves of German armor against the Allies in a final desperate gamble. The date would become infamous: December 16, 1944. The place, the forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and would be there in his Sherman with his notebook facing not 92 Tigers but an entire German panzer army. But what happened to between September and December, the 3 months that military records barely mention, contains a chapter that few people know, a chapter about a mechanic who became something more than a mechanic, and a lesson about what happens when the man who helped win the battle becomes the man they blame when the next battle starts differently. That story, the final chapter, is what Part 4 is about, and it begins with letter wrote home to Cleveland on November 3, 1944, a letter that his family kept secret for over 50 years. A former auto mechanic from Cleveland named wrote observations about Tiger tank weaknesses in a small notebook. That notebook helped reshape how's 3rd Army fought the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. In Part 1, insights reached 3rd Army headquarters and confirmed its own anti-Tiger doctrine. In Part 2, Those tactics shattered the first German defensive line, destroying 11 Tigers. 90 minutes, in Part 3, when the Germans adapted by turning Tigers. Ambush predators hiding in villages, forces adapted faster, creating a village trap system that turned every town into a killing ground for tigers. Of the 92 tigers committed to Operation Iron Hammer, fewer than 5 survived the 72-hour battle, but the question that Part 3 left unanswered is the one that matters most. What happened to the mechanic who helped kill the myth of the invincible tiger? The answer has a twist that nobody expected, because success in war sometimes carries a price that no metal can repay, and its price came due 3 months later in the frozen forests of the letter wrote home on November 3, 1944, the letter his family kept secret. For over 50 years was addressed to his mother, Helen, at their house on East 71st Street in Cleveland. It was 4 pages long, written in pencil on U.S. Army stationery, and it said things that had never told anyone in his unit. He wrote about the men he had watched die, not in tactical terms, not in the clinical language of reports. He wrote about the sound a man makes when he's burning alive inside Sherman tank. He wrote about Corporal James Dunning, his former loader who had been killed at Montclair in a Tiger ambush. He wrote about a French girl, maybe 10 years old, who had been killed by a stray 88 round that passed through a Sherman and into the house behind it. He wrote that he could not sleep without seeing their faces, and that the only thing that kept him functioning was the work, the engines, the tanks, the mechanical problems that had logical solutions, unlike the problems inside his head that had no solutions at all. Didn't know the term. Nobody in 1944 did, but what was describing in that letter was what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The mechanic who understood machines better than anyone in his regiment was discovering that the human machine was the one thing he couldn't diagnose or repair. Despite this, kept fighting. His reputation had grown. After the Tiger engagements in September 3rd, Army intelligence had formalized his observations into a technical bulletin distributed to every armored unit in the European theater. Was promoted to sergeant. He was invited to brief new tank crews arriving as replacements on Tiger identification and weaknesses. The mechanic from Cleveland had become an unofficial instructor in armored warfare, lieutenant colonel, who had been promoted after the Tiger battles, kept close to the planning process. Whenever the regiment expected to encounter heavy German armor, consulted about mechanical vulnerabilities to assessment and tactical positioning. It was an extraordinary role for an enlisted man, and it generated resentment among some officers who felt that a sergeant with no formal military education had no business influencing tactical decisions. Colonel, to his credit, had changed his opinion entirely. In a letter to division headquarters in October 1944, wrote that Sergeant possessed an intuitive understanding of armored combat that he had not encountered in 20 years of service. He recommended for officer candidate school, declined. He told he wasn't an officer, he was a mechanic. He just wanted to fix things that were broken. Then December came, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers with over 400 tanks and assault guns smashed through thinly held American lines in the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. His regiment was rushed north to help contain the breakthrough. The conditions were nightmarish: sub-zero temperatures, snow and ice that made roads impassable, fog that grounded Allied aircraft for days, eliminating the air support that had been so critical to the anti-Tiger tactics. In September, Sherman threw a track on an icy road near. On December 22nd, while he was outside the tank in freezing darkness trying to repair the track, a German artillery barrage struck the road. Shrapnel from an airburst round hit in the left shoulder and back, dragged him behind the tank and applied field dressings until medics arrived. Survived. He was evacuated to a field hospital and then to England. He would spend 3 months recovering. The shrapnel in his back could not be fully removed. He was given a medical discharge in March 1945, 2 months before the war in Europe ended. He received the Purple Heart to add to his Bronze Star. He was 24 years old. He went home to Cleveland. Never returned to his uncle's garage. The shoulder injury limited his range of motion, making it difficult to work under cars. He took a job as a quality inspector at a Ford plant in Brook Park, checking engines on the assembly line. It was steady work. It used his ear for machines, that same instinct that had let him diagnose a Tiger's weaknesses by listening to its engine. He married a woman named in 1947. They had 3 children. He never talked about the war, but his real legacy was not in Cleveland. It was in the doctrine, manuals, and war colleges of a dozen nations, and the influence of what men like him contributed to armored warfare extended far beyond 1944, the combined arms anti-tactics that Third Army perfected against the Tigers in September 1944 became the foundation of American armored doctrine for the next 8 decades. The principle was simple but revolutionary at the time. No single weapon system wins battles. Coordinated systems win battles. A tank alone is vulnerable. A tank supported by artillery, air power infantry, and specialized anti-vehicles is part of a killing system that can defeat any individual weapon, no matter how powerful. This principle was in U.S. Army Field Manual 1733, published in 1946, which explicitly referenced the Tiger engagements as case studies. Combined arms operations against heavy armor. The manual was updated for the Korean War, where American forces used nearly identical tactics against North Korean T-34 tanks, coordinating tanks with artillery and close air support to achieve kill ratios that echoed the September 1944 battles. In Vietnam, the combined arms approach evolved to include helicopter gunships and precision artillery, but the underlying principle remained the same: no single system fights alone. Everything coordinates, everything attacks simultaneously. The enemy cannot respond to 5 threats at once. During the Gulf War in 1991, American M1 tanks faced Iraqi T-72s in conditions remarkably similar to the open terrain of France in 1944. The Iraqis, like the German Tiger crews, had superior defensive positions and expected tank battles. Americans channeling doctrine, use speed flanking maneuvers, air supremacy, and combined arms coordination to destroy over 3,000 Iraqi armored vehicles in 100 hours while losing fewer than 50 tanks. The kill ratio was almost incomprehensible, and the tactical DNA could be traced directly back to the fields of eastern France 50 years earlier. NATO doctrine during the Cold War was built around the assumption that Soviet heavy armor would pour through the Fula Gap into West Germany in numbers that would dwarf the Tiger deployment of 1944. The response plan, called Battle Doctrine, was essentially 5 principles scaled up to a continental level: combined arms, multiple axes of attack, deep strikes against supply lines, relentless tempo, never let the enemy fight the battle they planned for. Over 40 nations adopted variations of this doctrine, from West Point to taught the Tiger engagements as textbook examples of how tactics defeat technology. The total impact is impossible to quantify precisely, but military historians estimate that the combined arms revolution that crystallized in 1944 has influenced the training of over 12 million soldiers across the Western Alliance in the 8 decades since. The principles observed in his oil-stained notebook became the grammar of modern armored warfare. But the biggest lesson from story is not about tanks or tactics or technology. It is about where good ideas come from. Was a corporal mechanic. He had no military academy education, no training in tactical doctrine, no credentials that anyone the chain of command would have recognized as qualifying him to comment on armored warfare strategy. He was, by every institutional measure, the last person who should have been contributing to how a regiment fought Tiger tanks. And yet his observations were right, not because he was a genius, because he was a mechanic. He looked at the Tiger the way he looked at it with a bad transmission. He didn't see a legendary superweapon, he saw a machine, and every machine has specs, tolerances, failure modes, and breaking points. The experts in the room, the West Point graduates, the career officers, they saw doctrine and history and strategy, saw a machine with a turret that took 60 seconds to rotate and an engine that drank fuel like a man dying of thirst. This pattern repeats across every war and every era of innovation. The people closest to the problem often see solutions that the experts miss, because experts are trained to see problems through the lens of existing doctrine, and doctrine is just yesterday's innovation hardened into dogma. British sailor who figured out that citrus fruit prevented scurvy was ignored for decades by naval surgeons who knew better. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics who were told by the most credentialed physicists of their era that powered flight was impossible. Spencer, the engineer who invented the microwave oven, had no college degree. He noticed that a candy bar in his pocket melted near a magnetron and asked why. In modern warfare, this lesson has become explicit policy. the U.S. military's Rapid Innovation Fund, specifically solicits ideas from junior enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers, the modern equivalents of. The Israeli Defense Forces are famous for their flat command culture where a private can challenge a general's tactical decision in real time. These aren't just cultural preferences, they are institutional that the person closest to the problem, the mechanic under the tank, the driver behind the controls, sometimes sees what the general behind the map cannot. In the business world, the same principle drives every startup that disrupts an established industry. Founders of were design students, not hotel executives. The creators of were music fans, not record label presidents. Innovation doesn't come from credentials, it comes from proximity to the problem and the courage to say what you see, even when everyone with more rank and more experience tells you you're wrong. And there is one final detail about story that almost no one knows. In 1998, military historian named Dr. Robert was researching Third Army after action reports at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. He found something unexpected in a box of documents from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. It was a single-page typewritten dated October 1944. It was a recommendation from Lieutenant Colonel to Third Army Intelligence proposing that the anti-Tiger tactical procedures developed during Operation Iron Hammer be formalized and attributed to their original source. His recommendation included a name not his own, not Captain Hayes, not Colonel. The name on the document was Corporal Edward J., U.S. Army, and the document recommended that the tactical bulletin be officially designated the protocols. The recommendation was Third Army. Staff decided that attributing tactical doctrine to an enlisted mechanic would undermine the authority of commissioned officers. The bulletin was published anonymously as Technical Bulletin 4417. His name appeared nowhere in it. The most influential piece of anti-tactical guidance produced by the American military in World War II was written by a corporal from Cleveland, and for over 50 years nobody outside his regiment knew it. Dr. Trackdown's family had died in 1991 at the age of 70 in the same house on East 71st Street where his mother had received that letter in November 1944, had died 2 years before him. His children, 2 daughters and a son, had no idea about the document. They knew their father had served in Third Army. They knew about the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. They knew he never talked about the war. They did not know that their father's observations had helped reshape how the United States military fights armored battles to this day. In 2003, the Association of the United States Army published Dr. S. research. For the first time, the name Edward was publicly connected to the anti-Tiger tactics of September 1944. A small ceremony was held at the Army Heritage Center in Pennsylvania. Son Thomas accepted a commendation on behalf of his father. Thomas later told a reporter that his father would have been embarrassed by the attention. Dad always said he was just a mechanic who got lucky. Thomas said he never thought he did anything special. He just looked at the Tiger and saw what was broken, from a mechanic with an oil stained notebook to a tactical revolution that influenced 80 years of armored warfare across 40 nations. Proved that the most dangerous weapon in any army is not the biggest tank or the most powerful gun. It is the person who looks at an impossible problem and sees it differently than everyone else. 92 Tiger tanks were sent to stop. Fewer than 5 survived, not because the Sherman was better, not because the Americans had more money or more factories, though they did. They were destroyed because a mechanic who had never read a tactical manual understood something that generals with decades of experience had missed. Every machine breaks, every weapon has limits, and the side that finds those limits first wins. The war fixed, and then he fixed how America fights. He never knew the full extent of what he accomplished, and that might be the most important lesson of all. People who change history rarely know they're doing it. They're just solving the problem in front of them with whatever tools they have, the best way they know how. If you know a story like a person who saw something nobody else saw and changed everything, share it in the comments. History is full of mechanics and farmers and teachers who did impossible things because nobody told them it was impossible in time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because the greatest stories from the Second World War aren't about generals and presidents. They're about the people whose names were almost lost. The people who won the war, one observation, one notebook, one crazy idea at a time. The Tigers are gone, the Shermans are in museums, but somewhere Right now, there's another mechanic looking at an impossible problem and seeing what everyone else has missed. That's how wars are won, that's how the world changes, and that is why this story was worth telling.